I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 17504 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, again, we have the great privilege of hearing from Vietnam veteran John Shoemaker, who served with the 196th Infantry Brigade over in Vietnam. He has written a series of columns about his experiences over there in Vietnam. In this episode, he is going to share with us a heart-pounding story about what happened to him and his platoon on a mountaintop out at Cam Duck, way over in Vietnam. It is not your usual story where the Americans run into a bunch of NVA in an ambush and they get all cut up and somebody has to call in a napalm strike on their own position just to save them. No, this story is the exact opposite of those, and I'll guarantee you are going to be spellbound when you hear John Shoemaker tell what he and his platoon did on a mountaintop way out at Cam Duck in South Vietnam. That's in the Badlands, not far from the Laotian border. Without any further ado, all right, now you're going to talk about your column titled Vietnam Diary that appeared in the Metro West Daily News of Framingham, Massachusetts. Go for it. You got the microphone.
All right, well, welcome back to the podcast. What I want to do today is talk about an episode that occurred in Vietnam, a time that was very troubling. And I have really tried to write about these stories, and I have had the cooperation of Phil Maddox and Caitlin O'Herlihy from the Metro West Daily News, who have published many of my stories. And as a result, that newspaper was acquired by Gatehouse Media, who then was acquired by Gannett. And Gannett is a large publisher that owns 260 newspapers across the entire United States. So a lot of my stories have appeared in many of the cities and towns of the United States. But here, again, with this recent Memorial Day, I wanted to bring some visibility to Cam Duck. It's entitled The Vietnam Diary. And so I'll read from it and give you some sidebars along the way. My dreams take me back to Cam Duck, where a day at war gave me a perspective that has lasted a lifetime. I stared out the tall terminal windows at the Zurich airport in Switzerland. This is where I had been operating as a vice president for a high technology company, actually in Austria, but needed to fly in and out of Zurich. I spent quite a bit of time in Europe. But on this day, I looked out the windows and down the long runway and then glanced over the mountains that surrounded it. The view offered a perspective that brought back vivid memories, a perspective that has lived with me for many, many years, over 50 years. It's incredible the time that goes by. The announcements were loudly declaring that it was now boarding time for the Flight 64, nonstop to Miami. My long and arduous business trip was over, and it was time to go home. I settled into my economy class seat with barely enough room for my knees or enough room for my shoulders that rubbed against the stranger sitting next to me. He spoke little English, so I just smiled and prepared for a long flight. As we lifted off, I stole another glance out the window of those mountains, snow-covered and so beautiful. Then I took my melatonin pills and drifted off to sleep. These were mountains, but they were not snow-covered. They were covered in green. I was back in Cam Duck, Vietnam, 1970, near the Laotian border in I Corps, the northernmost sector of the Americal Division, U.S. Army. Marines were north of that. And at one of the main entrances of the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail was Cam Duck. After 2 years, our Army battalion had returned to an area that was overrun during the Tet Offensive in 1968. I tried to explain some of the background of that battle in my earlier podcast. It was an incredible battle involving a massive airlift of over almost 2,000 soldiers and personnel. But in the course of the battle, 27 Americans were left behind who were killed and their bodies were not recovered. So here it is 2 years later. As a lieutenant, the first lieutenant in charge of the 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company for the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, the Americal Division, our mission was to provide security for this old Green Beret airstrip. It consisted of one long dirt runway, nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains and jungle. I both admired their beauty and feared the potential death that could rain down from them. While my platoon was out on patrol, about a mile out from the airstrip, we heard machine gun fire and explosions behind us. The enemy had sneaked up a river valley and just before dawn attacked the main perimeter guarding the battalion headquarters, and they had 105 howitzers that were positioned just off the center of the airstrip. The MVA needed to take those howitzers out of commission. Fortunately, one of the guards, only days in country, was awake and alert. He spotted the movement and sounded the alarm. Some thought the green newbie was just scared and given a false alarm until the flares showed that there were 24 enemy soldiers, sappers, running at full speed toward the barbed wire compound from the river's edge. From the canyon where the river was, you had to come up this hill, and as you crested, you only had to run 100 yards before you hit the concertina, and there the guns were, behind sandbags. Fortunately, they lowered those guns point blank, and they, with flares lighting up the whole place, and with all hell breaking loose, they fired point blank using beehive rounds, and they caught the enemy in the open and cut them down in minutes. The sappers were carrying satchel charges. They never reached their intended targets. We did lose a couple of soldiers, but all of the sappers were killed, and I believe it was 22 in the final count. A few hours later, the hulking front-end loader used to clear the airstrip of crashed planes and helicopters from 1968 and smooth out the runway was now using its bucket to collect all the bodies for a mass grave. I got word from battalion that the enemy was moving in to shoot down the supply planes, mostly C-17s and C-123s, plus, of course, the Chinook helicopters, as they tried to land with valuable supplies and reinforcements for our Operation Elk Canyon. I remember the excitement as 3 platoons rushed to load onto a dozen Hueys for a combat assault into an area north of the airstrip, patrol and confirm if the enemy was moving in on us. So it was a major combat assault that was involving most of Bravo Company and would be the first one, actually, for a new captain that just took charge. And I was one of his more experienced lieutenants that is having at least months of experience in different terrains, from the rice paddies to the jungles, from the sand south of Da Nang to the mountains. And so after the Pathfinders had cleared a section of the jungle so that the Hueys could come in fast, hover momentarily, and we had to drop off. Of course, there were many trees with stumps so that you had to literally jump from the Hueys. And then they would lift off from the landing zone, and with their engines straining, you know the sound of a Huey that is just maxed out, trying to move as fast as it possibly could in the whop-whop of those blades. The pilots scrambled to get out of there before the enemy could react, while skimming just over the tops of the massive trees that went up around the edges of the LZ. Jumping from the venerable and vulnerable Hueys, we quickly moved into the woodline. My third herd, as we called ourselves, as we were ordered to lead the march. This is where, oh boy, I'm the most experienced, so I'm going to be the one that's going to be having the platoon be point as the company would follow behind. The thick jungle forced vigilant map study to make sure that where I was going at every step as we moved in a long single file. We had to cut through. A navigation mistake here would be totally unacceptable. I felt incredible pressure to check and recheck that map going forward. And the use of that lensatic compass and a map and a grease pen, that was really the greatest set of tools that I could use to make sure that we knew where we were at all times. It was unbelievable to even think about being lost in mountainous jungle near the Laotian border. After several hours of getting through this thick jungle growth, we reached the main ridgeline that ran perpendicular to one end of the airstrip. It was amazing how the ridgeline was literally rose up and went for miles east and west on an airstrip that went north and south. It would be a perfect position for the enemy to take out planes that would typically fly in from the north, turn around, and fly straight back out. So it was right in the glide path. After several hours of getting through this thick jungle growth, as I said, I gave the signal, and we all stopped. We got down to hug the ground and take a moment to double check the map, drink water, catch our breath, pick bugs off, leeches, and then just listen. The musty smells of the jungle floor were intoxicating while we tried to cool down from the incredible heat and humidity. We were coming up the steep ridgeline to get to the top, and we were exhausted, given we're also carrying backpacks and all of the ammo and also enough to be able to stay out for a few days. Tension increased since we could see the jungle thinned out and the top of the ridgeline was somewhat narrow, dropping off on either side. I reported all of this to the company commander, and he ordered me to proceed. In the line of march, I always, as lieutenant, walked third, behind my point man and my cover. Point watching for the booby traps, cover man looking for an ambush or soldiers or whatever. So then I could direct movement as well from being in third in line, especially if we made contact with the enemy. I could motion as to where to go, how we would move, what weapons I would need, pull up my pigman, and so forth. We strained to see what might be ahead of us, peering out from under those heavy steel helmets. Maintaining silence was imperative as we skirted around heavy leaves and branches. It would only be a matter of time and we would find them, or they would find us. The loser was the last to know. Finally, the ridgeline widened. And a trail turned to the left. We followed it for about 50 yards and slowly walking off trail to avoid booby traps. My point man, and in fact, several men behind me, heard sounds. And so the whispered and frantic movements of trying to let me know what was happening. I stopped. Everyone dropped. I assessed what was going on, and I could also hear. So with arm movements, sweat pouring off my body, and with my eyes wide open to see what would happen next, I looked at my soldiers, and their faces were contorted. You could see that they had big questions and real fear. And they would not get immediate answers except what I could do. Thinking we might have the enemy to our right flank, with arm signals, I said, okay. The entire platoon of 25 men did a right face movement, and we prepared to attack. We literally walked in line straight towards the enemy that we had seen. There was nobody else out there. There could not be any civilians. With our hearts pounding, fingers poised, and mouths dry, we moved in unison. It was really remarkable to feel an entire line of 25 men moving through thin jungle. You had tall trees, but it wasn't thick banana trees at the ground level. And we had done this practiced it many times at Fort Polk and at Fort Sherman and the Canal Zone. You know, in many ways, I thought I was in a dream. After going a few yards, both sides opened up at the same moment. The crack of gunfire going back and forth. Our M16s and M60s laced the jungle in front of us with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. The enemy, AK-47s, the report, that very distinctive sound. You know exactly that's the enemy, and the difference in the noises is something you listen for. The trees were slicing all around. You could hear the bullets whizzing through and slicing the leaves and hitting the wood and so forth. And you could hear and feel the bullets whizzing right by us. And we just ran as fast as we could forward. And I can't say I was the only one running. I mean, we were all running and yelling at the same time. Yelling, they're over here, they're over here. It was bedlam. We charged as we heard the voices yelling, but clearly they were moving away from us. We were running and shooting as we yelled. The adrenaline rush was unbelievable. The M60s were braking left and right in front of us. 5 minutes later, it was over. I checked to see if any of my soldiers were hit, first and most important. I was surprised to find that everybody made it. Not one soldier was wounded, not even scratched. Unbelievable, I thought to myself, how lucky are we? We rushed around the main bunker and the foxholes, newly built, but most of them were unfinished, with several enemy bodies on the ground and in positions where they were holding their backpacks on their arms and their weapons. It was clear that they were totally surprised, and they grabbed what they could and were on the run when we got them. Equipment was scattered everywhere. The big prize was the Russian-made, or although it could have been Chinese-made, 51 caliber anti-aircraft gun that we had captured. It was erected on a large tripod with metal shoulder supports to guide the gunner with large gun sights. A smaller version of what everyone saw when Hanoi Jane Fonda was sitting in one during her infamous visit to North Vietnam. So I have to admit that I looked at this gun, this anti-aircraft gun, I was amazed. I was overwhelmed what this gun could have done. And the images in the past that I have seen of North Vietnam and that whole experience with My Lai, Jane Fonda, and all of that, even before I came to Vietnam, to actually be there, the only thing I was so disappointed is I didn't have a camera to take a picture of it. Later, while my men were policing the area of all the weapons and the gear, I went to an opening in the foliage. Literally, it was a hole cut in the foliage on the side of this ridge line, and my mouth dropped when I looked down from this high ridge to see the airstrip in plain view. It was right there. Couldn't have been more than 2 miles away. At that moment, the unmistakable thundering noise of a very lucky C-17 came flying in just over our heads. I almost felt like I could reach up and touch the belly of it. It was incredible. It was so close. It passed quickly. It dropped down to land on the airstrip. At this point, all of a sudden, the noise from the pilot woke me up with a start as he loudly warned us to return to our seats and put on our seatbelts. I was still in my seat on this plane going to Miami, and we were due to expected turbulence in preparation for our landing. Groggy and hot, I noticed my shirt was stained and with sweat, and my heart was beating fast, and my arm was shaking. The gentleman sitting next to me, he just stared at me. He looked worried, and he said in very broken English, "Are you okay? Is there a problem?" I gave the universal sign of a thumbs up with a nod of my head and thought about that other plane landing that day a long time ago. I thought to myself, wow, life is all about perspective. How lucky am I?
What a story. That was 2 stories in one. That incredible story over there in Vietnam and your flight to Miami. Something else I just realized, hearing you tell that story, had your platoon not gone up and ran those NVA off that hilltop, that aircraft flying in would have probably been shot down.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it. I mean, literally, I could probably take down the planes with a M16. With a 51 cal, it would have chopped them up.
That must give you some tremendous job satisfaction in a case like that.
Absolutely. I mean, I was overwhelmed with feelings of victory.
Oh, man, that was an exciting story. And I really appreciate you sharing this story with us. It's really good coming from, as they say, directly from the person that experienced it. I was excited to be just listening to it. And I really appreciate it. We're going to end it here, but I think what I'm going to do, since you've written so many of these stories, is ask you sometime in the future to come back and tell us some more of your favorite stories. Plus, I want to talk to you more about what you've done since you got out of the military, because you are a primary example of the tremendous representatives of the Vietnam veteran generation who showed that the Vietnam generation was a great one and did not deserve any of that abuse that we received when we came home. And so that's a very good story, too. I want to talk about that one, too. So right now we're going to end it here with that exciting story about what happened out at Cam Duck. And we will be talking again in the future, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Very good. I'm so glad to support this effort.
There you have Vietnam veteran John Shoemaker's heart-pounding rendition of what he and his platoon went through out at Cam Duck in Vietnam. I'm sure you will agree it was an amazing story, and I am so impressed with everyone in that story. I am hereby issuing John Shoemaker and everybody in his platoon an official Vietnam Veteran News podcast salute for the brave things they did up on that mountain in Cam Duck, Vietnam. John, we appreciate so much you coming on and telling us about your adventures in Vietnam, and I'm looking forward to more of your stories in the future. I am thanking everybody who came to listen to your story and encouraging everyone also to stay tuned for more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?